podcast with All Tech is Human. We are an organization that focuses on accelerating tech consideration and building out a hub for responsible tech. If you're interested in joining us, which I hope you are, please join us at alltechishuman.org. Really excited today about the guests that we have, special guests that we have, and also your audience participation. So I want to advocate that you can insert your questions that you might have if you're tuning in through Periscope or YouTube, and then we'll see a lot of those questions and then insert them. So today we're talking all about unintended consequences and human-centered design and tech ethics. Really a big hot debate, but we're going to try to be a little more granular with it. I'm the moderator. I'm the founder of All Tech is Human. My name is David Ryan Polgar. Please reach out to me at Tech Ethicist on Twitter. So excited about our guest today. We have Raina Kumra. She is a partner at The Fund LA and also the CEO of Juggernaut. In addition, a huge advocate for tech ethics and recently released a tech ethics class on LinkedIn. So check that out. I've been going all over it. The Wheel of Misfortune, which I think we'll talk about a little bit later. We also have Sheryl Cababa, who you may know has been part of the All Tech is Human community for a while. She participated leading our strategy session last May at All Tech is Human Seattle. She is the VP of strategy at Substantial and also a human-centered designer. So Raina and Sheryl, welcome to this conversation.
Thanks. It's nice to be here. Thanks for bringing us together, David.
Well, no, thank you for being here. And again, everybody else who is tuning in, again, insert your questions. About 10 minutes in, we should start incorporating some of those. But to really kind of frame some of the conversation, we'd love to just learn a little bit more about your background, and then we'll kick it off with a few questions. So, Raina, we'll start with you. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of your work in the field of tech ethics and unintended consequences?
Sure. So my original career, actually, my first career was in digital advertising. I worked on the dark side for about 15 years. I led digital at Wieden & Kennedy. I worked as an interaction designer at RGA. So I sold a lot of Nikes to a lot of people. And I was there at the dawn of programmatic advertising. And, we really thought we were solving this amazing problem. We're like, oh, we'll just get ads in front of people of stuff that they want because we know what they want. So this is going to be great. We totally made their worlds better. So fast forward to many, many years later and a few career changes later, I basically have been doing penance since then. I worked for the Obama administration. I worked at the State Department doing digital innovation, and I led a international media federal agency in all of their digital transformation work. And then I hopped over to startup land and started a tech startup called Maven that worked in India with all of the apps, and it was an app engagement platform. And we basically had access to everyone's data for every app in India for a little while. And at one point I was like, I wonder why we have so much access. And it was just this little loophole in Android. And we were able to see what people were doing when they were accessing dating sites, when they were not, and when they were doing other things. And I thought, this feels really invasive. And so after that, I shut down that startup and I went over to Omidyar Network to help start the tech ethics portfolio there. I started as an EIR, and because I had all of this very recent operational experience being in the field, having conversations with funders, I had realized the word ethics had never come up once in any of those hundreds of conversations, and it was not on anyone's mind. And I thought, hey, we need to change this. And I developed the Ethical OS out of that while I was at Omidyar Network. And it was sort of based on this theory that, we need to talk about this and help shift norms, because there is this day of school that everybody seems to have missed in tech.
Well, I really appreciate that, Raina, and I'm just to let everybody know, I'm the student in this conversation, taking down copious notes. I took down a few that I'm going to get back to in a little bit that you mentioned, but I want to also bring in Sheryl to hear a little bit more about your background and really kind of what got you deeply involved in this space.
Sure. And Raina is an insanely hard act to follow. after
Not
she's
at all.
described her entire background.
I
I'm
know
kind of
I know
like,
your
no.
CV as well. So
I know your
yeah.
superpowers.
It was like one thing after another. I'm like, oh yeah, I'm just a designer.
No.
Yeah. So anyway, I've been working in tech for the last couple of decades, and I started out at companies like Microsoft. I worked for Philips for a long time, and I've been a design consultant now for about the little over the past 10 years, working for companies like Adaptive Path and Frog, Artefact and Substantial, where I am now. And it's kind of interesting. So I think as most of these organizations have focused on essentially design thinking and human-centered design, I've always kind of taken the lens of my work as with my background as a design researcher and strategist, in kind of investigating how we can design products and services better for end users and really taking on the role of end user advocate. And that I think that's kind of like a natural position and inclination for designers who work in UX design and human-centered design. And I think many of us had a wake-up call, of course, like in 2016 with the US election, just the idea that we might be having more widely just more systemic impact in terms of the work that we're doing that is actually an unintended consequences if you think about the way that we design products. So I've been working since then. I'm an educator as well, and trying to consider how in the design practice we can more explicitly integrate ethics, more explicitly integrate outcomes-focused thinking. And I think because I work a lot with social impact organizations, the Gates Foundation is an example. I've worked with government organizations as well. And I think oftentimes we can borrow from some of the tools that they are using to consider outcomes and systemic impact, like integrating theory of change and systems thinking, for example. So that's an area that I've been working is just trying to help designers and technologists more explicitly integrate within their processes and methods, more explicitly ethical thinking.
So I think that should lead us to our first question. So Sheryl, you're talking about getting designers and technologists more kind of involved, or maybe take on more of the social responsibility. For my own work and what I've noticed, it seems like a lot of times we ask the question, well, who is responsible? For either of you to kind of jump in, where do you think we are on that? Do you think that technologists and designers are realizing that this is a major part of their responsibility, or do you think we're still in kind of a shifting landscape where everybody is trying to decide, all right, well, does this go up to the CEO? Is this something that it's for politicians to have better guardrails? Is this something about, hey, it takes somebody to build it, therefore we need to focus on the technologists and designers? It seems like right now we're still kind of pointing fingers. So Sheryl, if you want to kind of start us off with that, where do you think we are with technologists and designers taking that responsibility?
Well, I think there's definitely a perception that we need to be more accountable for our work, especially in terms of societal impact, right? And I know this is like a bad answer for a panel, but it's complicated, it's nuanced. I think there's also the responsibility, of course, in terms of policy. And yeah, it goes all the way down. I think what troubles me most is when practitioners or technologists who are just kind of working within companies are kind of like, these kinds of decisions are below my pay grade, or sorry, above my pay grade, and sit exclusively with, our CEO or what have you. And it's kind of like, I see a lot of technologists absolving themselves of responsibility because they're working on just like one little aspect of maybe a platform that is that they readily acknowledge is doing damage in the world. I think Facebook is a good example, right? I think and we can all like kind of watch it playing out in real time. Just last week, many of their employees walked out because of the decision making, of course, of their CEO. And I think what's hard is like they don't feel equipped to be able to necessarily have positive impact if they feel like the decision making power lies with those who are above them or outside of their organization or what have you. So my hope is that we can find ways to be more accountable directly in our decision making and be able to connect the decisions that we make in kind of our day-to-day work to those broader decisions about how we're having an impact on society.
Raina, do you have any thoughts to add on to that? Because it seems like that's very connected with a lot of your work, especially with your LinkedIn class, about how sometimes a designer or technologist might not be thinking about some of the negative externalities tied in with the use or misuse of a product.
Yeah, no, Sheryl hit it on the head. Like people think, oh, I'm just working on this small feature. Like, you know, what do I have to do with ethics? This is not my problem. And it's not been anyone's problem for so long that we have all of these problems that have resulted from it. So I think it is everybody. I mean, there's an individual responsibility that is lacking from the norms that, you know, are enforced in a culture. So I'd say I look at the organization, and all organizations are just a group of people doing different things, and every single person in that organization, the organization as a whole, really needs to have a culture where it's okay and it's also good to bring up these ethical topics and to bring up questions and to hit the button, the red button, the pause button, or whatever, if there's a concern. Because right now, at least up until this point, and I think things are changing now because they have to, it's been very easy to hand wave over them, like, oh, it's not a problem that we have to deal with right now. That's a minor thing. That only affects like 1% of the population. It's okay if, you know, certain facial recognition technologies accidentally tell the police that someone else is guilty and when it wasn't, you know, their fault. You know, IBM. But I think it's everybody. It's employees. It's the boards. Boards have not been held accountable. This is something that I am constantly pounding the table on.
Snaps.
That's if I can jump in with that, Raina. That's the kind of follow-up question I want to ask with you. One, you mentioned the boards. We had a great discussion at our last Ethical Tech Summit with Lisa Lewin, who serves on the board with the Wikipedia Foundation, talking about that need for that. But I also wanted to explore, since you have a background in the world of venture capitalism. I remember at our first event for All Tech is Human, where we had a kind of panel discussion, we had a technologist who raised his hand and he said, hey, I've got a startup. We're dealing with a lot of very sensitive data. I want to do the right thing, but at the same time, I have VCs who invested in my company who are breathing down my neck, trying to say, well, that's where the money is. The money is in the data. So even though you want to do the right thing, guess what? The startup is a Shark Tank, and you know how many startups are going to just go belly up. So, what do you have to say on that? Like, what do you see the responsibility from the investor side as well? Because it seems like somebody from an individual level might want to do the right thing, but doing the right thing might make them go out of business.
Yeah, I have been in that exact same situation with investors when we had our startup, and they're, you know, it's like we have all these data flows, we have all this access beneath the app layer of activity, and you know this isn't good. And they're like, oh no, you need to monetize that immediately and monetize it. And so, you know, it was the beginning of the end of our company, but you can always rebuild another company. You can't ever claw back things that have happened with people's personal data and how it might affect them for a lifetime. So I think, you know, it's just weighing that. And yes, it's hard. It's very hard when you're when you take money from the wrong people. And those are hard lessons that I think every entrepreneur learns, maybe not in, you know, the nicest way, but you make better decisions. And you also have to have these conversations about ethics to see where people stand, if it's even on their mind.
Okay.
Yeah, and just like one note about human-centered design, as you know, Sheryl is talking about. I think so. It's so important for people to understand that you have to keep humans at the center. I think so many of the problems that we have today are because we never kept humans at the center. And it's really the only exercise and toolkit that we have is to apply that and use that. And I talk about that in my course in an abstract way, but it really is about keeping the user at the center.
I think now is a good time. Speaking of keeping humans at the center, we also want to keep our participants at the center of this conversation. We're going to bring up a first comment, and then we have a couple other ones that are coming in that we'll get to in a little bit. So our first one, could you talk about your experience bringing up the discussion of ethics within organizations that may not be a priority or commonplace for? What was successful? What wasn't? So Sheryl, would you like to jump in on that about incorporating ethics for organizations that this might never have been in their vernacular?
Yeah, I have some experience with that as a consultant. Oftentimes, like I've been hired as a design consultant to just kind of like think about the design and strategize about the design. And so when you start talking about ethics and they're not ready for it, they'll just be like, oh yeah, we don't need to think about that right now. I think that's been changing over the years where people know they need to be thinking about it and addressing it, but it's still not prioritized within processes, within KPIs, within organizations. And so it's really hard to get organizations to make time to integrate good ethics practices when they're not rewarded for it in the end, right? So if you're working within an organization or a team where your KPIs are tied to, let's say, I don't know, increased traffic or something like that, but you know that your methods for increasing traffic are ethically challenging, then it's going to be really hard to try to make better decisions that might affect those numbers. And so I try to make the connection with clients around, okay, what are your actual KPIs? Are you actually going to suffer if you integrate new methods into your process that might make things slower, that might result in lower numbers for your existing KPIs? And we need to strategize about what we need to do within your organization to shift that, or we need to kind of consider, what can we do in the meantime that might help surface this as an issue. It can be really super challenging. And I think what's more challenging is when I'm talking to teams who aren't just fundamentally aren't ready for this thinking. So I have an example of a client that I was working with. Yes, I'm going to spill some tea, but a client that I was working with who's working on emerging technology. And it was funny, my team and I were using an example from Black Mirror, to say oh yeah, this kind of happened in this episode. And, it's something that have you considered this angle or what have you? And I'm trying to be very vague. And one of the members of the client team, it was a brainstorming session, and one of the members of the client team was like, oh yeah, that's a good example. Could you capture that as an opportunity? That feature is that's meant to be a cautionary tale. You guys, that's not supposed to inspire you about how to violate people's privacy or what have you. And it was kind of a wake up moment for me, because I'm not everybody has this mindset right now. And there is a lot of work to do to kind of have it, have people actively thinking about it. And that's a first step. So there's a mindset shift. And then there's how do I integrate this into my process? How do I challenge my organization? And people aren't going to be doing the process organizational stuff until that mindset shift happens. And so people are in very different spaces right now in technology companies about integrating ethics, and some have not even started. So I think it's a challenge on all these different levels. And I know that's not necessarily a satisfying answer, but we do what we can to kind of help make it accessible by use of tools like the Ethical OS, or some of the tools that I've worked on. So it's a good conversation starter.
Raina, do you think that the phrase ethics, do you think that that sometimes can be a mental hurdle for people, especially who might not have had a broad kind of liberal arts type of education? I know that's a topic that comes up frequently about, do we need to have more of a multidisciplinary type of thinking? What are your thoughts and perspectives on that?
I mean, the word ethics is just so loaded and it's so accusatory. I think people just immediately, if you're trying to have a conversation with them that is framed as an ethics conversation and they work in tech and they probably haven't thought about it, or they're on the venture side and they haven't thought about it, they don't like the word. They don't like being, finger wagged with that word. And I think some of, like, if there was a way to rebrand it, like, we absolutely should. But some of it is also expanding the definition of ethics and maybe making it a little closer to human-centered design. I think that could be another way to look at it. But yeah, I've encountered that. And in my early research, I had people that were like, just tell me flat out. I'm like, I don't like that word. It makes me feel bad. It makes me feel like I've done something wrong. And that's not it at all. It's just the lack of doing anything, really.
Well, do you think then it's going to evolve more into a corporate social responsibility type of understanding for people? You hope not. Okay.
I really hope not. Yeah, I'm not. CSR serves a great purpose for many things, but this is something that has to be integrated, like Sheryl was saying, into the organizational structure. There needs to be checks and balances all over, because even if you have a culture with ethical people, you don't necessarily have a ethical structure in place, and you need both.
Yeah.
So Sheryl, I saw you wagging your head on that, and hey, you already spilled some tea. So you have the juicy nuggets to offer us on that with corporate social responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, I think yeah, I'm not anti-corporate social responsibility. I do think it's like shunted into its own space within an organization with its own budget, and it falls separate from core products and services. And so it's almost like I don't want to call it this, but I can't think of another term, but I sometimes feel like that's kind of like an ethical side hustle for companies, like where it kind of absolves them of the responsibility of their day job of creating like these core products and services. And so I'm really interested in sort of trying to encourage core teams and organizations in integrating this, rather than kind of thinking about it as this separate entity. One thing that I've seen is I worked recently with Microsoft on some of their toolkits, and I kind of like how they've repositioned it within the company, just because I know that at first they were kind of talking explicitly about ethics, and now they've called it, especially for AI, responsible AI, so that it seems less likely to kind of raise those hackles about like, oh, I think you're saying there's that defensiveness of like, by integrating ethics, it means you think I've been unethical up until this point, right? And there's an automatic defensiveness there. Whereas when you're like, okay, we want our AI to be more responsible, it's a little bit of like a Trojan horse of like the ethical practices being integrated as, here's something that you can kind of objectively use within your processes. There's also this perception, especially if you haven't study the humanities, that ethics is kind of like a highly subjective thing. And so, rather than have to educate on the term ethics, like it's like, let's just educate on the practices that you should integrate in order to be more ethical. And maybe that means a reframing in terms of language. So I really like what they've done there at Microsoft by calling it responsible AI.
Well, another topic that brings up, and I also see a comment. Yeah, I guess I meant your head shaking, not wagging.
I just saw that.
So somebody did correct me on that, which is true. But sometimes I get so excited about this conversation that I misuse phrases.
Yeah, no offense taken.
Well, thank you. What I was going to say is there's also a lot of discussion around companies that are hiring chief data ethics officers. But then on the flip side, people worry about quote unquote ethics washing, or that you are kind of delegating sole responsibility on one person as opposed to diffusing it throughout the entire organization. Raina, do you have any thoughts on that about what you see as new roles and whether or not they're effective?
Yeah, so having been through multiple digital transformations of very big organizations and being the digital transformation person, that is not the effective way to do a transformation. If you're trying to do an ethical transformation, hiring a chief ethics officer or director of ethics, or someone who you can like hang all your ethical baggage on, isn't the right way to do transformation in an organization, because it just falls on that person or it falls on that department and it doesn't get integrated. It has to be a layer, and it has to be within each individual person. It has to be on each department. It has to be part of their KPIs. It has to be something that's discussed at the board meetings. Investors need to hear reports about it. It has to hit every piece of the ecosystem. And I've found that the companies that spend the most on their CSR, on talking about ethics, are often the ones who are covering something up more. So you can almost always see that, see how much attention they're giving to the PR side of it. And I would consider like a chief ethics officer almost like a PR type of a move, because they want to like bring, they want to bring this and tell you that they're doing something and it's very visible and the signal is high, but it doesn't mean that actual change is taking place. And actual change taking place means really shifting your structure so you cannot go backwards from that point.
Okay. We're going to bring in a few of the questions that we have coming in. This one from Matthew. Could you speak about the blurry ethical boundary in design between persuasion and engineering of people's beliefs and behaviors? Thinking here of captology. So this obviously brings to mind a lot of the recent reports around Facebook, right, being told kind of a couple of years ago that a lot of their design might have been causing greater kind of conflict between people. It seemed like that research might not have been incorporated fully into some of their design, but persuasive design certainly a hot topic. So Sheryl, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I want to say it kind of depends on how it's being used. So you see persuasive design being used. Richard Thaler wrote a book several years ago called Nudge, and I think that's really inspired kind of behavior change design in the industry. I think it's in tech, it's been terribly misused. Just in terms of, you look at things like infinite scrolling, for example, on news feeds, and those are behavioral manipulations that understand our need for randomization. It's reflected in the UX, kind of this desire to kind of keep your eyeballs engaged and continuous. And so I think it really, I think one of the reasons that I frame some of the methods that I use as outcomes-centered thinking is because what is the outcome you're trying to achieve from that, and how does it benefit those who are using your products or those who are affected by your products that aren't even using it? Is it meant to only benefit your company? Is it meant to benefit your shareholders over those who are kind of the people who are going to be most affected? I know Uber, for example, got into some trouble a couple of years ago when the New York Times wrote about the psychological tricks that are being used in their driver app to keep people driving around and accepting rides. And a lot of it just felt very much like what you would call dark patterns, right? Just like this idea that you're using these behavioral manipulations to get people to do something that probably isn't in their best interest. Mm-hmm. And I know people have different ideas about what's in the best interest of someone, but I think we really need to kind of interrogate what are the outcomes that we're seeking for our end users and end beneficiaries, or how are we potentially creating harm? And that might give you more guidance in terms of when behavior change design is appropriate. So I'd like to see it used in a more responsible way in the technology industry, just because I think it's been terribly misused up until this point, especially by products that depend on essentially a capitalization of people's attention.
So Raina, what do you think then about the recent push with a lot of the social media platforms to maybe lessen the infinite scroll? You see on Instagram how it's saying, hey, you're kind of all caught up. You see a little bit of a push against that. Do you think that that is effective, or do you think that there's something else that still needs to be done?
I think it is effective. I think, calling out dark patterns in design and like seeing some response from some of the companies on it is a start. I think the problem still comes down to their business metrics are completely misaligned with anything that has anything to do with humanness and being a user-centric company. So until we can get better metrics, we're kind of stuck with, this is how we're going to do our, third quarter report, and it's based on this much viewing, it's based on this many minutes, this much attention. And I think they haven't yet come up with a holistic metric that actually shows quality of interaction. There's a couple of really great researchers working on that and trying to establish new metrics in this industry, but the metrics are what you measure is what you get, and that is just going to keep happening over and over again.
I have an interesting question that Nina just posed. If an app, website, product, or any technology would suffer financially from introducing or improving ethical guidelines, is it inherently unethical in the first place? So when I read that, it brings to mind what's the connection between ethics and law. Is our understanding of ethics on more of a sliding scale of understanding. So Sheryl, do you have any thoughts to add on with that question, right? So when we have to actually talk about making a product more ethical, does that mean that the product is inherently unethical to begin with?
Yeah, I think this is a good example of why I could try to avoid getting into the discussions about just like whether something's inherently ethical or not, because I think what I'm looking for is, and I mean, this is kind of like an ethics philosophy to begin with, is like, what do you want to happen at the end? Like after your sort of design and product decisions are out of your control. And usually we can gauge whether the outcomes are beneficial for society or not, right? So I don't think you could look at something like, let's say, Instagram as inherently unethical, though I do think that, there are ethical challenges in terms of some of the outcomes that we see in the world as a result of using Instagram, right? Or as a result of using Facebook. Facebook's a good example because of their decisions that have led to these algorithmic outputs that, basically surface and prioritize misinformation or disinformation. The outcome is essentially unethical, right? And so I think the better way of looking at it is like trying to anticipate what's going to happen as a result of your decision making and determine whether those are outcomes that are good for us or not, just like across the board. It might be good for one person. It might be good for your Facebook group that is extremist white supremacists or something like that. But in the overall, like looking at it through the lens of society, is that going to be good? And I think that's kind of like maybe a more appropriate framework in terms of like being able to evaluate your decision making.
If we look specifically with the issues, let's say, of Twitter, that early on was connecting this as, hey, it's a public square, it's leading to democracies flourishing across the world. Now people have accused it of being kind of associated with authoritarian governments that are seemingly flourishing. So I guess the question would be, if a company like Twitter then has to hold the weight of these decisions, does that give those companies almost an uncomfortable level of power, right? Because now we're saying, okay, you need to take the weight of the impact of society that your product is having. These are publicly traded companies, as opposed to these decisions residing in the transparency of traditional kind of governmental kind of workings. So, Raina, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same as we would have to expand metrics. We have to expand what shareholder value actually is, what the components of shareholder value mean now today. And yeah, the Twitter, Facebook, they all have incredible responsibilities. Some taking them, some not. But I think that you can try to claw back some of the things that they've done. Twitter, is certainly trying to show us that they actually are on the side of truth, and they don't want people to do any sort of riot mongering or anything on their platform. So that's a step in the right direction, but it's slow. It's been very slow, and allowing politicians to all out lie on Facebook's platform is a very interesting non-decision. And I think that if they just had the mindset of fixing things as quickly as they broke them, that might be a better balance than just trying to do little band-aids here and there, or not trying at all in Facebook's case.
Cool. I'm going to move on with a question that Alec just kind of brought us in early on about accountability. What do you think about the imbalance of accountability? For example, if AI damages human lives, accountability is diffused. If humans damage AI's hardware, they are already delinquents. I think a topic that this brings up would be something like self-driving, autonomous vehicles. There's always been a lot of discussion around if these decisions are being made by the self-driving car, does that get diffused if there's any type of accident? So, Sheryl, what are your kind of thoughts or comments about that? Do you think that there would be a danger about who's responsible? So, for example, let's say you got, well, we won't make you get injured by a self-driving car. Let's imagine some person got hit by a autonomous vehicle. Who do they blame? Do they blame the company? Do they blame an algorithm? Right. Whereas now, if there's a car accident, you blame you blame a driver, a human. It typically would be a person responsible. So what are your thoughts about how this responsibility might get diffused through technology?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm the right person from a legal perspective to be answering those kinds of questions, but I do think that we have to take into consideration integrating these systems to replace basically human interactions or human accountability. I think an example that kind of falls into that category is, now within the legal system, you have, let's say, a human judge or human lawyers or what have you. And I've gotten this question before, which is well, could AI potentially be more fair than, if you had a racist human judge? And that certainly could be true. I don't know if we can assume that that would be the case. And I think one of the problems with that too is if you have just a human who's problematic, you can try to do things about that human. You can report that judge, you can word gets around that that's what's happening. I think what's fundamentally problematic with AI is the decision making is not transparent. And so you could have a racist AI system that is making the decisions that human judges used to make. And in that case, it's kind of well, I don't know exactly who would be held responsible, except for the people who have implemented that technology in the first place. So it's an interesting question. And I think our sort of systems of accountability are not like well equipped to basically, we don't have like the frameworks in place to kind of like answer that question right now. And I'm not sure what the right answers are. I do push for the idea of technology companies being more accountable for the software they're releasing in the world. I think some of them have, kind of enjoyed sort of neutrality in terms of, like Facebook has stuff on their platform, but they can't be sued or held accountable the same way a publisher is, because it's user generated content. And perhaps that has a lot to do with the situation we find ourselves in today. And so it definitely feels like what we're experiencing right now is a lack of accountability within the realm of technology companies, and that probably needs to shift.
Okay. And on that topic, we are doing a discussion coming up on Section 230, which you are referring to, but we just got a bunch of interesting questions pop in. We only have about 5 minutes left of our conversation, so we'll try to get to a few quickly. This one from Erin, really glad she threw this one in there. Are there agreed upon standards for tech ethics that teams can reference when designing standards for their own companies? Thinking about best practices. Wow, good question, because this comes up a lot. We're all sitting in the United States right now. There's been a lot of accusations that we're promoting tech ethics that would be imposed upon people in kind of a like eat your broccoli type of fashion, as opposed to the dramatic differences of, let's say, United States, where it's hyper individualistic versus more collectivist type of societies. So, Raina, do you have any thoughts on that, about the kind of ethical standards that we're utilizing?
Yeah, I mean, we developed the ethical OS so that there was at least the beginning of a conversation among teams. I don't think it has to be super complex. It does have to be very tailored to your business. And Erin is actually an amazing founder who is building an ethical company that works on data and presenting that to investors, and shows you exactly under the hood of what companies are doing what. And I think transparency amongst your team, transparency with all the data that you get, those are all really important things to have. There's like a list of ingredients, but you can always just work off of a checklist. And a checklist is something that doctors use, pilots use. These are life-saving devices. We can absolutely employ a checklist of 10 things in any company. And part of the reason why I love early stage funding so much, and I'm so passionate about it, is because before a product is fully baked is the best time to influence all of the ethical practices and structures. And I think there's no end to what you can do with the early stage companies, and there's also no end to the problems of products that are already out there and released. So checklists will help at a certain point, and after that, it's all mitigation and speed with which you react.
And on a related front, do we have any examples of people or groups working on ways to capture these metrics on ethical performance? We have organizations like IEEE, which has done a lot of really kind of important work around ethical standards, but are there any others that come to mind for either of you?
So it's not necessarily on ethical performance, although you should check out Floodlight, Erin's company, who made the comment before. That has some data on performance, but Eli Pariser and Talia Stroud from UC Austin are working on a project called Civic Signal that is actually trying to reframe what quality of interaction is. Like, what are the things that we should actually measure as a healthy democratic society versus a capitalism infused as the first and only thing that matters society?
That's a good point. So, Sheryl, as we are looking at the time, we're kind of at our closing point. I want to kind of emphasize to everybody that they can stay in touch, because this is just the beginning of a conversation. So please reach out. You can send us an email at hello@allthichishuman.org. Also want to take this time to thank our organizational partner for this event called TheBridge, that bridges the gap of understanding between policymakers, politicians, and technologists. But Sheryl and Raina, I want to give you both a little bit of time to have any closing thoughts, but also where people can get in touch with you and find out more about your work. So Sheryl, we'll start with you.
Sure. So you can find me on Twitter and LinkedIn. It's just at Sheryl Cababa. And my company is Substantial, and you can find us at substantial.com.
Wonderful. Raina, what about yourself?
I'm at Raina Kumra on Twitter and LinkedIn, and you can find me there. And my website is juggernaut.is, and I help organizations transform from point A to point B, no matter what the kind of transformation they're trying to do. And I am also a partner at the fund. That's the fund.vc. If you have an early stage company that is looking for funding, we have a thesis that is very aligned with ethics.
Terrific. Well, it's a fascinating discussion, and I think it's only the tip of the iceberg. So I hope we can continue this with everybody. I want to thank everybody at home for tuning in and the great questions. Again, please stay in touch. We hold these live streams every 2 weeks. We have one coming up on Section 230, and also one on how we can create anti-racist technology. So I'm David Ryan Polgar with All Tech is Human. Also, again, thank you to TheBridge as our partner. And Raina and Sheryl, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks both. This is fun.
Bye.
Bye.